Amazon RDS-like simplicity on any infrastructure. My name is Jack Allen, and I will be your moderator today. Joining us is Chip Childers, Vice President of Product Strategy at CumuLogic. Throughout our presentation, we encourage you to submit questions using the questions pane on GoToWebinar. We will answer questions live at the end of the presentation. Please keep in mind that all participants are in listen-only mode. We are recording today's session and will email a link to the recording tomorrow and post links on the CumuLogic website. Let's get started. We'll kick off today's webinar with Chip. Chip, over to you.
Thanks, Jack. So thank you very much, everybody who was able to join us today. We appreciate it. This is one of our 30-minute webinar series. The idea is that we're going to try to get you a bunch of information, but not too much. Leave a little bit of time for some questions, and hopefully make sure that we fit this all into a quick 30-minute window and get you out of here as soon as we can. We'd love to hear from you after the call, both via email, or if you've got questions, please, like Jack said, give them to us as we go. So we're here to talk today a little bit about the enterprise perspective on CumuLogic itself, and talk a lot about how RDS, as an amazing service that Amazon has put out there, is really doing great things for people that are all in on Amazon, but how CumuLogic can give you the same type of database as a service experience regardless of the infrastructure that you're using. You could use it on-prem, you can use it in other public clouds, you can use it on Amazon, and have some consistency across all of those scenarios. So for an agenda today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about first the architecture of CumuLogic's database as a service software platform. Just as a little bit of a primer, this is information that will be useful for you as then we dip into each one of the 6 deployment option examples that we have. And we'll run through each one of those. We'll talk about some of the pros and cons of them. We'll talk about different integration options you might have depending on how deeply you want to bring CumuLogic's orchestration tool into your broader IT management portfolio. And then, like I said, we'll spend some time on Q&A. So first, though, let's describe what CumuLogic's database as a service platform is in very simple terms. And if you're familiar with Amazon RDS, we offer software that lets you provide an RDS-type experience to your application teams, again, on any infrastructure. This isn't just about provisioning databases, because provisioning databases is only step 1 in the overall life cycle of a database. Once the systems are deployed, they need to be maintained, they need to be managed, they need to be monitored, you need to back them up, you need to be able to initiate change to them, you need to be able to tune them and grow the clusters. All of that is really what makes up the full life cycle of a database that's been deployed, and our software makes it really easy to have all of that happen automatically, or some of the actions are self-service functions that are easily done via API or via our web UI. So we've designed the service around the level of abstraction that RDS has, which is that you really think of it as a controller that takes care of provisioning and care and feeding for the databases, but you write your application to just talk directly to the deployed database environment. So we today support MySQL, Percona, and then we also support MongoDB and Couchbase. Now, those aren't relational databases, and my analogy to Amazon RDS does break down a little bit because it's not a relational system. Neither one of them are relational. They're document-based. But that said, we've spent a lot of effort to work with both of those companies, MongoDB and Couchbase, to make sure that we can bring this RDS simplicity to their NoSQL environments. So with Mongo, we can do anything from simple single-node deployments, multi-node replica sets, but we can even deploy fully sharded clustered environments. With Couchbase, we can deploy clusters of Couchbase Server. We can allow that to scale as your application demands it. All very easy to use. Architecturally, this is the way that we think about our software. The user experience is through either an end-user console or the administrator of our software has their view into the system. You can also interact with the platform via APIs, and anything you see on our UI can be done, the same actions can occur via the API. That's because our UI is really just a client of our API. at that middle layer, we've got this notion of data services automation. These are the common functions that we support across all the different engines, database engines that plug into the framework. That includes notions of clustering and sharding, monitoring, automated health checks, and automated node recovery if there's an outage within a particular node in any cluster, security-related functions, role-based access control, backup, restorations, and actually we also support an RDS, an Amazon RDS API as an optional add-on that you can add to the controller, and that allows you to actually take maybe an application that's been written against the RDS APIs, point it at a CumuLogic controller, and get equivalent functionality out of our backend. And going down another level, I mentioned that we've got various databases that we offer through the software. Today, again, MySQL, Percona Extra DB with Galera clustering. It's kind of a MySQL replacement or swap-in option, and then MongoDB and Couchbase. And then we get to the interesting part, which is really where you as an enterprise are going to have a lot of choice about how you deploy our software and where these databases are going to be provisioned. Our controller is able to talk to the VMware vCloud API, CloudStack, or Citrix Cloud Platform, multiple OpenStack distributions. All of those APIs are out of the box supported by our software. We also support Amazon's APIs as well. That means we can work directly with Amazon EC2, or we can work with Eucalyptus if you have an on-prem Eucalyptus environment. Now, because we're very API-driven, that means really any public cloud that's supporting all the APIs I just described is fair game. You can target database deployments to any of them. And then last, and one of the more interesting things, is that we support the notion of pools of virtual machines or simply pools of bare metal servers that can serve as units of allocatable capacity, which means you can do bare metal database deployments, but get that as a service experience. We'll spend a little bit more time on this because really the infrastructure options are what makes the deployment flexibility so powerful for you. And that's what we're going to dig into as we go here. So just very quickly, this is a simple way to describe the deployment architecture of the CumuLogic software. The very first point I'm going to make to you before we get into how our controller gets deployed is to say that CumuLogic does not get in the data path between the applications and the database. That means that you're able to scale these databases like you would today manually. If you've got a DBA team that's today manually installing new nodes to a cluster, growing the cluster, they're used to that type of experience, and all of their knowledge about how to scale these environments, how to ensure that they're right-sized for the applications that are going to be driving traffic to them, all of that applies. It just gets a lot easier for them, or it becomes self-service for the application teams. Now, our controller is very lightweight. Typically, for proof of concepts or pilot deployments, we recommend somebody downloads a virtual appliance. We've got a virtual appliance available in a number of different form factors. That single VM can be booted. In it, we'll have the CumuLogic controller, software itself, an internal MySQL database for metadata. And then you can log into the UI and immediately register different target cloud API endpoints, and you could start provisioning databases. Very, very simple, very lightweight. Now, if you start relying on the software to manage production environments, then that's where you have to basically take that controller, you do a multi-node deployment with it. Now, our controller scales horizontally. And what you're largely dealing with there is approximately 1,000 deployed virtual machines being managed by our controller per small controller virtual machine. So that's roughly the scale that we're talking about. So if you've got, say, 3-node clusters is the average database size that you're deploying, you can get 300 solid database deployments, and CumuLogic's controller can take care of that for you, again, because it's 3 nodes per cluster. Now, if you make that CumuLogic controller a virtual machine or hardware-based system much larger, then that number 1,000 can certainly go up. But we can easily scale horizontally as well. Okay, so understanding the basics of the architecture here, we're control plane. We work with target infrastructure. We ask for the virtual resources necessary. We then push the appropriate software to the new VMs or into the bare metal systems that we've got as units of capacity in our pool, you're then able to work with this infrastructure to enable a number of different options for how you're going to be deploying the environment. So the first example is the most common, and this is where you're taking the CumuLogic controller and you're integrating it with a private cloud infrastructure as a service environment you've got on-prem, or it could be hosted by some provider. But the idea is that the experience that your application teams will have is one where they're going to have both access to provisioned virtual machines directly or other cloud services that you might have as part of your portfolio, but databases are going to be part and parcel to that portfolio. And you do that by deploying our controller, and you deploy it with the infrastructure as a service controller. Let's say we're talking about an OpenStack distribution. Then you would have the OpenStack compute controller nodes, and our CumuLogic controller would communicate directly with it. Some enterprises just use the UIs directly. Others might choose to do a single sign-on integration between various UIs. It could be the Horizon dashboard going to our controller, or it could be that they've integrated everything via the APIs into an enterprise cloud dashboard of their own, and that happens quite a bit as well. Now, the thing to understand here is that tenants within your private cloud are going to be respected by our controller. And so what that means is that when a database is deployed, the virtual machines that will host those database nodes are going to live within that private cloud within the same tenant context as any virtual machines that might have been done directly. We do that through the use of identity synchronization. Now, we can also integrate with Active Directory or LDAP, and so you get a lot of tenant modeling possibilities out of this. So the next option is similarly has a single target where all the database systems are going to be deployed to the single environment. But in this case, what we're talking about is taking the CumuLogic controller and adding database as a service to a public cloud environment. Now, this could be a public cloud infrastructure as a service provider who doesn't offer database as a service today. As long as their API is compatible with our controller, and again, we support all the major APIs, you're going to be able to layer on DBaaS functionality here. And you will control how that database as a service environment is actually going to operate within that provider's infrastructure environment. The way that we think about tenancy in this case, there are really two different approaches that you could take. So first, one option, it's the simplest. You as an enterprise would have a single set of credentials into that target public cloud, and then every database that's being deployed by our controller can live within that same tenant. That's the simple model. It's especially useful if, for example, you want everything to be provisioned within the same virtual data center or VPC. Within our controller, though, since we do have very much the notion of multi-tenancy baked into it, you could also give each application team their own credentials to the approved public cloud that you want to point them at, and then map those credentials to their CumuLogic accounts as well. And then each database that's deployed would be within the tenant that was created for each application team. Next up, we've got single tenant database as a service appliance sitting in a service catalog. A lot of companies today, they're going through the process of looking at the problem of IT as a service just in a very general sense. And they're not necessarily saying, hey, we're going to be infrastructure as a service focused. What we're actually doing is we're saying these are capabilities we want to offer, and these capabilities are sort of bundled IT solutions. And in this scenario, you're not saying we want to offer you databases as a service, but you are saying to the application teams, you can control your own database as a service infrastructure, and by adding the CumuLogic controller to your service catalog, you can easily deploy lots of CumuLogic controllers. Each one would be under the full control of the application team. Now, again, this might make a lot of sense in enterprises that are large enough that each app team might very well have their own operations group. It's very useful in that scenario where that ops team really wants to make sure that the apps that they're responsible for, including all of the tooling around those apps, is something that they control. They've got admin rights to. And a central IT function could just say the enablement for database as a service is what we're going to offer you in the catalog. So next up, I mentioned this concept of deploying to bare metal or just virtual infrastructure that doesn't support higher level infrastructure as a service orchestration APIs. And this is really, really important to many of the customers we're talking to, because we all live in an environment where we have many different existing capital investments in hardware, in perhaps VMware infrastructure, large VMware farms, and there's really no reason why you can't deploy databases and get the same level of highly managed database deployments out of that infrastructure. And so what we can do is we can work with them. And the way this happens is that you as the IT department will go through the process of pre-installing a very simple CentOS-based Linux distribution and get these systems onto the network. Now again, they could be virtual machines, they could be bare metal. It really depends on what your needs are. But all they have to do is be sitting on the network and accessible by our controller. And then you go into the controller and you add perhaps a range of IP addresses and say, there are servers sitting in each one of these IPs that are available for CumuLogic to use as capacity. And our controller will effectively take ownership of those systems. And then at runtime, when a database is requested, servers are allocated, and then the appropriate software is deployed to those nodes. Now, of course, I mentioned early on, lots of enterprises have existing, bare metal capacity. They've got virtual infrastructure capacity out there. Those same enterprises might also have an infrastructure as a service environment that might be the new model that they want to use going forward. Because we support multiple targets, you can easily add a pool of bare metal systems to the same CumuLogic controller that's talking with your private cloud. So lots of flexibility here. Next up, hybrid public and private. Now this is where we believe most of the enterprise market is going to be going. You're going to have situations where you have private clouds and you also are making use of public clouds. Now the challenge here is how do you get consistency in your data services across these environments? Well, since CumuLogic can work with all of these various infrastructure options, you could easily create this sort of hybrid option. You might, for example, have the application teams deploying all their development, test, possibly even staging instances out into a public cloud. So it's easy to turn up. You can use the capacity as you need to grow the dev team, but if development of that application slows down, you tear it all down. That's a great use for public cloud. And then you might say, hey, all of the production systems, for whatever reason, could be regulatory, could be data ownership reasons, you're going to put into a private cloud. Now our controller is working with both, and so as databases are being deployed, the end user gets to select what infrastructure target that system, that database cluster will be pushed into. And in reality, there are some companies out there that are saying they're all in on public cloud. And when they say they're all in on public cloud, they usually mean that there's actually going to be a mix of providers, but they're trying to get out of the business of dealing with their own data center. And we can work there as well. You could certainly have 2 public cloud providers or more that are available for your end users to deploy to. This might be for the purposes of cost management. You could say, for example, that you're going to play Public Cloud 1 and Public Cloud 2 off of each other to get the best price at the time that you're going to do provision. And our controller can work with all of them, and it could have those options available to the app teams. The other reason why you might do this is that you've got specific geographic reasons to use Public Cloud A or Public Cloud B based on where the application is being deployed, based on end user latency characteristics, and you want the flexibility to have, again, that consistent database as a service experience, provisioning, full lifecycle management across all of these end providers. So just to wrap up, we're going to take a quick look one last time at the architecture just to review it again, make sure you understand what's in the system itself and the type of capabilities that you could deploy across all of these infrastructure options. We support MySQL, Percona, Mongo, Couchbase, all very easy to use for end users. We can do anything from simple deployments that are single nodes of any of these database engines, or we can do multi-node deployments, very large clusters that can scale all the way up to things like MongoDB's sharded cluster approach. And again, it's fully managed, monitored. We maintain the health of the system, so if a node goes offline, we'll bring a new node back online, rejoin it to the cluster automatically on the user's behalf. Backups happen automatically. Restoration is fully self-service, very easy to work with. And so with that, I'll thank you very much for listening, and what we'll do is we'll hand it back to Jack to see if we've got any questions.
Thank you, Chip. Participants, I want to thank you for submitting the questions that you have submitted, and I want to remind you that should you have questions, please submit those to the question pane and go to webinar. Chip, first question, can you review what databases CumuLogic supports today?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it was MySQL, and that's plain vanilla open source MySQL. Then we support Percona, XtraDB with Galera clustering functionality underneath it. We can do some very interesting topologies using the Galera clustering functions. And then MongoDB and Couchbase over on the NoSQL side.
Thank you, Chip. Next question. What single sign-on protocols are supported with your user interface?
Yeah, great question. So there are a lot of different single sign-on options that are out there. Today what we have in place is support for CAS as well as SAML. But certainly we're happy to talk to anyone who might have something that's different. You could, for example, be interested in an OAuth-based approach. Lots of different possibilities. Our controller has been designed to allow for plugins to be built that integrate various technologies at different layers of the stack. How we do authentication is one of those places where we can add plugins that support options that might not be out of the box today. So just because it isn't necessarily your choice to use CAS or to use SAML, if you've got something else, that shouldn't be a blocker at all. You should get in touch, let us know what it is, and we'll happily work with you to get it integrated.
Thank you, Chip. Participants, please, if you have questions, submit those in the go to the questions pane and go to webinar. Here's a question by the same gentleman, I believe gentleman, who asked what databases CumuLogic supports today. He says, thank you for reviewing those. Could you please talk about any future additions of additional databases that you'll be supporting in future releases?
Absolutely, happy to talk about that. So we are very focused on what our customers are asking for. And so what we've heard directly from our customers is they'd like to see Oracle, they'd like to see Microsoft SQL Server on the relational side. We've also had some interest in MariaDB as well as Postgres. It's likely that we'll be starting with Microsoft SQL Server, then moving to Oracle, and then we'll see how the customer demand evolves around Postgres and MariaDB. On the NoSQL side, certainly there are lots of different NoSQL technologies that are out there. The next up in our list of technologies to integrate is going to be Cassandra. That seems to be the most common request for NoSQL that we don't support yet. But we're also evaluating other options, Redis and CouchDB directly. So there's a number of different options that are on the table. Again, if we don't support your engine, we're very plug-in focused. So let us know what database you'd be looking for or databases you'd be looking for, and we're happy to work with you to make sure that that makes sense for everybody, and we can find ways to get it into the system.
Participants, I want to thank you for your questions. This will be, so that we can end on time at 30 minutes, this will be the last question that we ask Chip. Chip, how would I meter database usage?
Yeah, great question. And specifically for the enterprise, chargeback is the challenge, right? As virtual infrastructures have pervaded across the enterprise landscape, one of the bigger challenges has been VM sprawl. And so the notion of chargeback really started to take hold, and for many companies, departmental chargeback is very critical. So there's two different ways that you can do chargeback with us. The first is that you could choose to rely on the infrastructure as a service environment that you're working with. So if you're talking about a public cloud, that's where the question of how do you manage the identities within the public cloud comes into play. So if you give each application team their own public cloud credentials, it's very easy for you to take any service that's been deployed by them and match that to their department. Now, if you're talking about on-prem, the same notion applies, because you could tie a chargeback module to, let's say, vCloud, and very easily get that type of departmental accounting out of that infrastructure as a service stack. Now, alternatively, if you're dealing with something like the bare metal pools, or you're, for example, choosing to use a single set of credentials within some target cloud, that's easily accommodated as well. Our database tracks all usage. It ties it back to accounts. It's easy to extract this data so that you can feed it into whatever chargeback logic or chargeback system you have in place.
Thank you, Chip, for answering all those questions very thoroughly. Participants, I want to thank everyone for joining us. As a reminder, you will receive an email with the link of today's presentation within 24 hours. Also, we'd love to have you connect with us and keep the conversation going on today's event. So feel free to reach out to us anytime via the email at info@CumuLogic.com, as reflected in Chip's last slide. On behalf of our presenter, everyone here at CumuLogic, we thank you for joining. Have a great day and evening, no matter where you may be in the world. Goodbye.